Hey guys, welcome to the Old Ultra Runner channel. I'm your host Jay Tynert, and today I wanted to tell an old running story. It's about my third marathon I ever ran, that I ever completed, the Cowtown Marathon in Fort Worth, Texas in February of 1996. Back in 1996, it was a little bit different. I didn't know that many marathons. I did get Runner's World, I believe, and I would flip through there and you would see some races in other cities. And I'd heard of course, I had run the New York City Marathon. I was interested in running the Boston Marathon. You really only saw a few big marathons that were in the back of the pages of there. I think there were 4 or 5 marathons in all of the state of Texas that I knew about. There could have been a couple more, but there weren't very many more. There was the White Rock Marathon in Dallas. There was the Cowtown Marathon in Fort Worth. There was the San Antonio Marathon, which is since now, I believe, run by Rock and Roll, but back then it was just the San Antonio Marathon. There was the Houston Marathon, and I think just like the year before, or 95, 96, somewhere in there, is when the Austin Marathon started. It's now a pretty big marathon. And now there's a plethora of other smaller ones around. You can probably find a marathon to run in the state of Texas almost every weekend, but that was not the case in the mid-90s. I had run my first marathon, completed marathon, was the 1993 New York City Marathon. My second one was the 1994 Dallas White Rock Marathon, which I have a separate video about that, but it was like a year after the New York City Marathon. We were November of 1994, and I was just talking to my friends saying, oh, we just ran New York City a year ago. Why aren't we doing something now? So decided without training at all to ramp up in a month and try to run the Dallas White Rock. And I did complete it. But anyway, so in 1993, my New York City Marathon ended up being 4 hours and 34 minutes. In 1994, my marathon ended up being 4 hours and 20 minutes, 4:19 something. So I came up with the bright idea it was during 1995 that I was going to try to qualify for Boston, because the 100th running of the Boston was in 1996 and I wanted to try to qualify. Well, the qualifying time for that is 3 hours and 10 minutes in my age group. That's what it was back in those days. I think it's a little bit faster now, and you have to run a good bit under the standard to get in nowadays. But back then it was 3 hours and 10 minutes, and I decided I could try to do it. Well, I did have a lot more speed back then, but I got injured all the time. I rarely could make it through a marathon. I was fortunate to make it through a marathon training cycle without getting hurt. And sometimes I would have injury and miss substantial time during a cycle, but then manage to kind of throw it together at the end and get into the marathon. But I decided to do it. I was running hard in the summer of 95, the spring and summer of 95, hoping to hit that standard. And I was shooting pretty much to try to run the Dallas White Rock, because that was the easier of the 2 marathons in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. The Dallas White Rock was always considered a fair bit easier than the Cowtown, just because the Cowtown was always known as being very hilly. So that was my goal. I was training hard for it. Then in the late summer of 1995, they had a lottery for the 100th running of the Boston Marathon. I put my name in, and out of the blue, I was one of the 5,000 names that was drawn to get to run the 1996 Boston Marathon without a qualifier. So I was very excited. It actually ended up being pretty good. I ended up having some injuries a little later into the fall, and I got married to my lovely bride in October of 1995. So my training kind of went down, and I also was injured some. So I did not run. I postponed running the White Rock that year. I decided not to run it. I was going to be in Boston in April of 1996, but I ramped up for started ramping up for it and decided I was going to run the Cowtown Marathon in February of 1996. Probably not the smartest decision because it was only like 6 or 7 weeks prior to the Boston Marathon. But I went into it. I was probably not at as good a training. Well, I did as well as I could. I was probably in the best shape that I was ever in for a marathon, and definitely the best I was in for the next several years for a marathon when I went into the Cowtown. I wasn't in shape to run a 3:10, but I was in shape, I thought, to run maybe a 3:20 to 3:30 marathon. And I remember I took off and the race went really well for me. I was running well. I was pretty much keeping around an 8-minute pace, which would get you to a 3:30 marathon. I remember getting to about mile 22 and I was still on pace, but then I started kind of freaking out about, am I doing too much, running too hard prior to Boston? So I even have written down in my little log that I decided to walk a lot of the last 4 miles. And I did it just mostly to try to save myself, not to hurt myself before Boston. Back in those days, they were still kind of preaching that you do 1 or 2 marathons a year, and if you do more, you were going to impact your performance. And the elites do that today, but most of us slower people can tend to get a little bit more in than that. But so I walked 2.5 of the last 4 miles. My time ended up being 3 hours and 49 minutes and some odd seconds. I still feel like I probably could have on that day gone ahead and finished that off and run maybe a 3:30 to 3:35 marathon. Little did I know that would be my PR for several years. After that, I started continuing to have injury problems and was never able to get through a cycle real healthy, or would just get through enough of one to run. I had several other marathons under 4 hours, but I wasn't beating that 3:49 time. But anyway, I was able to finish the marathon. I was pleased with it. It was very exciting. Back in those days, I believe I was following some training advice from the original Galloway book on running, which was published in 1984. He was not, or I didn't have the book yet, of the version where Jeff Galloway proposed a lot of the run-walk strategy. I do remember a section in his original book where he said, in long runs in training, consider taking like a 5-minute walk, run for 25 minutes, then take a 5-minute walk, and it'll extend your ability to extend your distance. He was not yet to the regular intervals, like I think the next book I read, it was like run a mile and walk a minute. And then it's dropped down now where he has people that are taking much longer times in marathons, running a minute, walking a minute, stuff like that. But back in those days, it was much more of a traditional approach. I still was having trouble doing the volume, even that was recommended in the Galloway book or in most marathon training programs, or I would get injured. But I was following the advice a lot on how to safely increase your long runs, and that's what I mostly emphasized. I kind of remember that the plan was to go up a mile per week until you got to a long run of 8 miles, and then you would go up 2 miles at a time, but you would do it every other week. So 2 weeks later, you would do 10 miles. Then 2 weeks later, you would do 12 miles. 2 weeks later, you do 14. And then after you got to 14, I think you only went up every 3 weeks, but you would go up by, it was 2 or 3 miles. And that book still advised you going all the way up and running a marathon in training before you went. I think it even said 26 to 28 miles before you ran a marathon. But anyway, so my thought was that the Cowtown Marathon was my training for Boston. But the race went well. Like I said, I walked some toward the end and ended up with the 3:49, but it was still an extremely good experience. Running shoe wise, back in those days, I had gone to, because I was having running injuries, I had been to a podiatrist and gotten orthotics. I had orthotics in my shoe, and their recommendation was to wear as firm a sole as possible so the orthotic could do its job. So I remember running in some very heavy motion control type shoes. The primary brands I ran in back in those days, I had some Brooks and I had some Asics. I can't even remember the models, but I remember they routinely weighed 12 to 13 ounces. And I remember buying, I don't remember if it was that year or the next year, buying what I thought were featherweight shoes that weighed 11 ounces. These days I don't run anything, hardly anything that's that heavy. I probably have some trail shoes that are really heavily cushioned that maybe get close to 11 ounces. But anyway, it was a different time back then. Let me show a little bit of my memorabilia and then we'll call it an episode. I hope you enjoyed listening to this old story. If you like the video, please consider liking, hitting the like button. If you're interested in more of my content, I do old stories, I do tips, I do my current race reports, things like that. And if you're interested in more of my content, please consider subscribing to the channel.
Okay guys, this is the scrapbook my wife made of a lot of my early races. This was the finisher certificate I got for finishing the Cowtown Marathon in 1996. You'll see it says I had a time of 3:49:48. I placed in 187th place. I think there were just under 500 marathon runners that year, so it's not as impressive as it sounds, but I was very happy with the time. If we move over, there was my race number. I was number 534. And one of the big sponsors of the Cowtown Marathon was the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. This was the way we got our race photos back in those days. It wasn't, you didn't have like a bunch of them emailed to you. You instead got these little cards in the mail that you could order the photo. So this was me and you can see the huge heel strike, my heel way up in the air. But this was the photo. I only had one choice of a photo that year I could order. And here's my wife's, she put this down, my comment where I said I had a new PR but walked 2.5 of the last 4 miles to save my leg for Boston training. And then what we would get is the newspaper the next day is where you would see all the results. So there was a section of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram and it had pictures from the marathon. It had all the places. And my name is down here. I was in the 28 to 33 age group. I can't even find it, but I was somewhere in here. Jay Tynert, 349:48. But it went on for pages with all the places and all the places in the marathon and in the 10K. They had all the published places for the 10K. Now, kind of a neat thing when I look at this paper is a good friend of mine is Chuck Seafeld. He did the Hula Loop series and has done perpetual motion with me the last several years. Right in here, there's an article on his wife, Gail Seafeld, who won the Cowtown Marathon. And the article talks about that she didn't even like to run marathons. She was more of a fast 5K runner. But Chuck had signed up a team for a marathon team, for a team competition in the marathon. And one of their runners dropped out, so his wife Gail was asked to run at the last minute in the marathon. She says she really wasn't trained for it, but she did one 20-mile run. She really just liked doing the shorter, harder stuff. Well, she jumped in and won the marathon. So I just thought that was kind of a neat story. But anyway, those are my, back in those days, medals were kind of getting to be a thing, but the Cowtown Marathon hadn't adopted it yet. They were still giving out trophies to finishers of the marathon. So it's kind of a different keepsake, kind of cool. So I finished 1996 Fort Worth Cowtown Marathon, and I got this instead of a medal. By the time I ran the Cowtown Marathon again some years later, they were giving out medals. But anyway, I just thought that might be of interest. I hope you enjoyed the story, and thank you very much. Bye.